Okay, in terms of stuff, as always, just bad news. Someday good news, but not today. Deadlines, same as they've been most of the time. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, exam 3, deadline to file on June 17th. So basically 6 days from today. Then exam 4, quizzes part 4, exam 5, deadline to file on June 18th. So 1 week from today. And these are all end of day, so 59 p.m. For the paper, if you want to get the +5 bonus, which gives you your A score +5, be sure to upload that to Blackboard by end of day today. If you want to get the full credit, but not +5, be sure to upload it by end of day on June 15th. And for the half credit is June 18th, also end of day. And then I'll put in the final grades in on Friday, June 19th. And then they'll be in the Rather system, so you can like graduate or whatever. Again, be sure to check your grades, as things are going along, and definitely be sure to check them on the 18th, just to be sure everything is as it should be. If things are not as they should be, contact me as soon as possible. Email is probably the best way because that's accessible 24 hours a day. Because if you contact me after all the final grades are in, that's more problematic.
How does the famous quiz work?
Oh, good question. The way the famous quiz works is you just go to the survey thing, do the survey, put in the class you're in, which is the only one that's this semester, and then it basically acts kind of like a free quiz. And so what I'll do is go in and put in the points for that next week. And it's part of the assessment process. So totally anonymous, etc., etc. But points for you, basically. Okay, before pressing on to the new stuff, anything about the stuff to be, or the stuff that has been, that needs more stuff. Okay, so last time looking at our good dead friend, John Stuart Mill, who wrote a lot of stuff, pretty smart guy, died, still dead today. And we looked at utilitarianism, which the basic idea, again, greatest happiness principle. When you're deciding what you should do or shouldn't do, according to the utilitarian, you weigh the happiness or the consequences of the action against the unhappiness. If it creates more happiness than unhappiness for those who count, then it's good. If not, then it's bad. And then we looked at some problems for utilitarianism. And now we turn to our second moral theory. And once again, there are a multitude of moral theories. We're just picking sort of the two very common ones. And the second we'll look at is what's called deontology. Here's the idea. It comes from the Greek deon, meaning duty. As I mentioned before, duty as in obligation, as opposed to howdy doody or doggy duty. Basic idea for rule deontological views, the idea is basically this. If you ask the deontologist, so what do I do? And their answer is basically follow the correct moral rules. So it's non-consequentialist. They don't say, do the action that creates the best consequences. Their deal is basically following the correct rules. To be a little more particular, here's the idea. For a rule deontologist, the action is right that follows the correct moral rules. The action is wrong that breaks those rules. And if something is not covered by the rules, the moral rules, then it's neutral. Now, the rule deontologist, of course, since it's all about the rules, they have to give us the rules. And one thing about rule deontology that's worth noting is it doesn't require people just to obey any rules. So a person can't say to someone, oh, you're a rule deontologist, the rule is you have to give me $100, so give me $100. It doesn't work like that. It's not like any rule. What they follow is what they regard as the correct moral rules. And depending on which deontologist you talk to, you'll get different answers about what the rules are. Historically, there have been a couple main approaches to generating these rules. One approach is to have, say, an existing list of rules. And to use a historical example, consider, if you will, the 10 Commandments. Don't lie, don't kill, don't steal, don't cheat, don't covet, don't get caught. Those basic rules. And the idea is if you follow those rules, you're doing right, breaking them, doing wrong. Now, one limit on having just a list of rules is when you run into situations the rules don't cover. Now, one option, of course, is like make up some more rules or reinterpret old rules. For example, suppose someone bases their morality on religion, and they're wondering about the ethics of, say, genetic engineering, or artificial intelligence, or similar such things. And if they go to the religious text, they won't find references to artificial intelligence. They won't find reference to genetic engineering. So what a person would have to do is either like make up some new rules in the religious-based ethics, or look back at the text and try to interpret it to apply to today. Now, some stuff can be interpreted. You know, the rule about don't kill, that doesn't say, you know, don't kill people with swords. It just says, you know, don't kill. So you can apply that to everything from, you know, jawbone of a donkey all the way up to drones and nuclear weapons. Now, another approach is the one taken by our good dead friend Immanuel Kant, which is to have a rule that makes more rules. To use a crafty analogy, if you're familiar at all with like programming computers, if you have a programming language like HTML or JavaScript or HTML5 or C or C++ or BASIC or Fortran or Pascal, you can use that language to make more programs. So take a program, make more programs as you need them. So if you have a rule for making rules, you're always set. You just break out your rule maker, and then you get a rule. And you come to a new situation, break out the rule maker, get a new rule. Now, a lot of people like rule deontology. For example, a good dead friend Moses laying out the Ten Commandments. That can be seen as a religious rule deontological approach. Many religious-based ethics are rule deontological. They're based on rules, often quite explicitly. So why do people like rule deontology? Well, one reason is that people are familiar with the rules. You know, societies are based on laws, and so the model is already pretty well established. We're accustomed to following rules. Another appeal is it gives us a clear set of guidelines. Namely, here's right, here's wrong, and so we know what to do. A third reason is an appeal to intuitions. Now, interestingly or boringly enough, last time we looked at an appeal to intuition based on, you know, the plane crash. And to recap that, you know, after you graduate, become a doctor, you get an internship at a wonderful tropical island that sadly and tragically a plane crashes and 6 people are badly hurt. And you got to decide between saving 1 person or 5 people. And intuitively, we generally go with saving 5 over 1, because 5 is more than 1. Interestingly and boringly enough, put another way, we can be seen to have intuitions in general that lead us away from, you know, 5 is more than 1, to the idea that it's not the consequences that matter, that there are some things you shouldn't do. So the rule following view is focused on the ideas that breaking the rule is in itself wrong. It's not the consequences that matter, it's the rule itself. So breaking it, just wrong. To give the standard sort of intuitive illustration, here it goes. Once again, you know, graduate from, you go on med school, you're interning on a wonderful tropical island. And like in the previous scenario, your unlucky day again, in comes another plane, crashes. This time, there are, you know, 5 survivors on board, but they're all, you know, badly injured. So they need like lots of blood, and you'll need like some new organs to save them. Now, an amazing coincidence that only happens in, you know, movies, TV shows, and philosophical examples. A person who lives on the island, a hermit, who has, you know, they have no living relatives or friends. No one knows they're there except for you. And they come in once a year for their checkup. And they happen to come in, and there they are. In an amazing coincidence, they are a perfect donor match to everyone on the plane, amazingly. And so all you gotta do to save those 5 people is take the 1 person, give him a little shot, give him a snap, you take out all his blood, his lungs, kidneys, spleen, pancreas, etc. You're not actually killing him, it's the lack of like blood and organs that are killing him, and you can save those 5 people. So your choice is killing 1 person or saving 5. As a doctor, what do you do? Well, it's the same numbers. 5 is more than 1. But in general, most people say that would be, horrifying. Because it involves, killing someone and taking their blood and organs. And so even though a person might say on utilitarian grounds, 5 is better than 1, so sorry, Bob. But we think that to be awful, because we think it's just wrong to take people's organs. So intuitively, there are situations where we would tend to think in terms of not the numbers, the consequences, but some actions, as people say, that's just wrong. So if you have the view that some things are just wrong, rule of deontology could be appealing, could be the moral theory you're looking for. Now, our example of deontology is the deontologist, our good dead friend Immanuel Kant. We saw the stuff about him back in the ancient days of part 2. Nothing's changed. Still did a lot of stuff, wrote a lot of stuff, died, still dead today. Interestingly, boringly enough, Kant makes a distinction between two types of reason, what he calls theoretical and practical. Now, like most philosophers, he uses terms in ways that are kind of non-standard. Because you looked at it intuitively, we might think theoretical reason is, well, really theoretical stuff. Reasoning about quantum physics or like tax theory or things, that are pure theory. But what he means by theoretical reason, put kind of roughly, is what we consider sort of scientific reasoning. So reasoning about physics, chemistry, etc. Now, practical reason, intuitively think of like practical reason as being like a practical kind of person. The sort of person that can, if their smartphone gets messed up, they can like, reboot it, or if they're having trouble with their car, they can fix it with a paper clip and, some tinfoil. Some of that can, reason their way through stuff practically. But Kant means something different. By practical reason, he means what we would call moral reasoning, which of course can be seen as being kind of practical, but basically it's got, kind of crudely put, kind of like scientific reasoning and moral reasoning. And he takes them to be separate. He talks about like the laws governing the stars above, theoretical reason, and the inner moral law, which would be practical reason. Another thing that Kant does is he, as we'll see, he takes things that seem to be like totally different and says, yeah, they're really the same. And he says there can be, in the end, but one law, even though they seem to be like different. But he likes to say stuff like that. And he could be right, because he was Kant, he was really smart, and maybe people just don't get it. He wrote some major works in ethics, the critique of practical reason, and on the metaphysics of morals, and there are 2 really big books with lots of really long sentences. I remember in grad school taking a class in ethics, and one of my fellow students, he's looking at the book and he points like a whole page and he says, the whole page is one sentence. And I looked at it like, yep, there's all kinds of like, punctuation there, but it starts and then the sentence ends on that page. It's like, wow, that's pretty impressive. Now, I put a lot of emphasis on some pretty cool stuff, like moral worth of people, the dignity of people, and so his moral theory is actually very appealing in many ways, because he thinks that people, as we'll see, have worth and should be treated with dignity and respect, which seems pretty cool, since we're people. Now, one of the things that Kant is known for, among many things, is making a change in philosophy. And people who study Kant and really like Kant like to say that philosophy splits into before Kant and after Kant. But pretty much anybody who studies a philosopher and devotes their life to that philosopher say that philosophy, changed after that philosopher. This kind of thing they do. But here's one of the changes Kant made. Now, we talked about our good dead friend Aquinas a little bit, didn't talk about his ethics. I also mentioned our good dead friend Aristotle. And what they thought we could do is this. Suppose we want to know about ethics, what we should be doing. Aristotle, and also later Aquinas, said, well, you could look at the world and see how things are, and they'll tell you how things ought to be. In other words, you can get a ought from an is. For example, Aquinas noticed that if you try to kill stuff, it tries to survive, either run away or out of politeness it tries to kill you right back. And he kind of inferred that since things try to survive, things ought to survive, because it's sort of their nature, it's how they work. Because he believed, God built the world for a purpose, and so things do what they do because they are what they are. So we can make inferences about what we should do from what is. Now along came a guy, our good dead friend David Hume, who said, yeah, you can't do that. He famously said you can't get a ought from an is. Didn't argue for it, just said it, and people liked it, and so people still say that today. They'll say you can't get a ought from an is. And Kant agreed. So the old view was kind of like this. Here's like people, here's the world, and on Aquinas' view, God builds the world, and built into it is a way kind of like how things should be. From the way the world is, we sort of like observe it, and here's kind of like the moral pattern, I guess, and then we get our morals from observing the world. It's pretty put, it's out there. Now Kant says, following Hume, you can't do that. It doesn't work. And kind of his reasoning, people give is, if you look at an action, you don't actually see like good or evil in it. You just see stuff happen, crudely put. So what Kant says is this, he reverses it. Instead of us getting our morality from the world, he claims that built into us are moral, as we'll see in his theory, basically this moral system, these moral rules, based on our reason. And what we do is we put our morality on the world. To use a crappy analogy, think of the world as this screen, and think of the mind as the projector, and think of the projection as like us putting our morality on the world. Now, going back to our dreaded spectrum of morality, Kant fits into the absolutist camp. So he believes there's one correct morality, it's objective, no exceptions. But it may seem kind of odd, because he says, morality is in the mind, not out in the world, and we kind of like project or put it onto the world. So why isn't it just like subjective make-believe stuff? Well, to use a crappy analogy, we can look at morality kind of like, and when this analogy does break down, but you can look at it kind of like color. If I hold up the folder and I say, what color is the folder? Everyone will say, reddish. Actually, I use the bottle, it's a clear color. It's silver. Now we know, or believe from like physics and color theory and anatomy, that colors are not out there in the world. Colors in our mind. It's how we see stuff. So colors not out there. But we all see the same color because our brains all work basically the same way. There are exceptions. Some people are colorblind, so they don't see certain colors. And of course we know that different species see things differently. But anybody who's got like a kind of like a standard functioning brain, standard functioning eyes, will see the bottle the same color. So the color's all in our mind, but it is in a way objective. The bottle is, silver. And so Kant kind of works it that way. Morality is all in the mind, so to speak, but we all have the same basic, rationality, so we have the same morality, or so he claims. So what's his theory? Well, like anything, of course, you gotta have a cool name, because anybody who's been in marketing knows the name is very important in terms of selling, products. And there are good names for selling stuff, and bad names for selling stuff. And he calls his the categorical imperative, which sounds kind of cool. Sounds almost like a 1950s, car, a categorical imperative. Now, one notion he puts forth is what he calls the goodwill. Not the goodwill where you can like get rid of your old furniture, or you pick up some bargain price furniture, but literally the will that is good. And sort of stealing from, Socrates and Aristotle, he comes up with the notion that it is the goodwill that makes someone good. And other qualities, there are many other qualities, of course, that we, regard positively. We see like, courage is a good quality, intelligence is a good quality, cunning is a good quality. wit, humor, beauty, etc. All as good qualities. But for Kant, even though we call those qualities like good, he contends it's a goodwill that makes them good. Now, hopping back to Mill, we saw that Mill said, what's good is happiness. And basically he's very promiscuous with the happiness thing because on Mill's view, everybody counts. You know, it's the happiness of all, the unhappiness of all that matter. And Kant is not going to have anything to do with that because he says, quite critically, that you got to talk about beings being worthy of happiness. So he's not going to be like thinking that everyone's happiness counts. His claim is that to be worthy of happiness, one must have the goodwill. And he says, seeing a being that lacks the goodwill being happy would not please the rational spectator. So we're pretty strict about that. So right off the bat, he's not going to be one of those promiscuous utilitarians just handing out happiness to everyone. You gotta earn that happiness. Now he's also going to be critical of what's called virtue theory. This is put forth by our good dead friends Aristotle, Aquinas, Confucius, and some other folks, some living, the most dead. And their view was what you should do is develop your virtues. Now, Kant points out a problem that he actually stole from Socrates, which is the problem of the unity of the virtues. And here's the problem as he sees, well, here's the problem that Socrates presented. The problem for Socrates is that if you just have some of the virtues, but not like all of them, a person could be, like that clever rogue, could be very dangerous indeed. And what Kant does is basically kind of steal that idea, but put in, instead of like unity of the virtues, put in the goodwill thing. And his claim is this. If you have someone who's got many normally laudable traits, they're brave, they're intelligent, they're charming, you know, strong, clever, cunning, good at planning, there could still be a problem. How so? Well, let's take some of those qualities. Suppose someone is intelligent, reasonably good looking, charming, persuasive, reasonably brave. What would be a good career or a hobby for that person? Well, pretty much anything. But one could be, of course, serial killer. Because to be a serial killer, one has to be reasonably intelligent. I mean, anybody can be a mass murderer, but serial killer requires planning. And serial killers are typically, you know, charming, you know, people to lure their victims. And so you could have someone who's horrible, but has all these positive qualities. Or we could switch to, think of like classic villains of movies and TV shows. I'll bring up like Christopher Lee. He died today. He was the guy who was in, well, he played like Dracula in one of the classic movies in the old Hammer films. And you might have seen him in Lord of the Rings, although he wasn't a villain there. And he was also in the, you know, some of the early Star Wars, well, the later early Star Wars movies as Count Dooku. And when you think of like a character like Dracula, or Darth Vader, or any other classic villains, they're usually pretty competent, except for that evil part. And it's all those other qualities, their intelligence, their ability, that makes them very dangerous. Or use like a contemporary one from TV, think of like the character in Breaking Bad. Smart guy, very capable, ruthless, but that makes him all the more dangerous. Or in like the superhero genre, you can think of like Superman's foe, you know, Lex Luthor. Genius, but kind of a bad guy. Now, to really drive home the fact that he's not a consequentialist, Kant makes it pretty clear about how things are going to work. As he sees it, the only thing that's good in and of itself is the goodwill. And he illustrates this in a very extreme way. He says, imagine you've got the goodwill by itself, and it is unable to accomplish anything. In other words, the person who's willing the good just fails over and over and over again. And Kant says, failure or success takes nothing away or adds nothing to the goodwill. So it's not the consequences that matter, whether one achieves one's goals or not morally, it's the willing. Now by willing, he means more than just sort of like a lackadaisical expression of it. For example, if someone says, you know, I'd really like to go and help people who are like suffering and, you know, dying and stuff, but this couch is really comfortable, these Cheetos are really delicious, I still got a lot of Mountain Dew left, and I haven't quite gotten through, you know, finishing up Borderlands, so I can't get off this couch, but I really want to. Now Kant would say, well no, that's not really the goodwill. The goodwill is not just, you know, I really like to do some good stuff, but man, you know, there's a lot of good stuff on Netflix. For him it means truly willing it, with all one's being. But his view is, as long as you totally will it, you don't see the consequences. It's the willing that matters. So crudely put, it's not the results of the actions that matter, it's what your will is. If you're truly willing the good, then the action is good. If you're not, it's bad. Now of course there is the practical problem of how do you know what someone is really willing? Because people say all kinds of stuff and you really can't tell except by trying to estimate from what people say and do what they really will. But for Kant, you know, there would be this objective measure. Is someone truly willing the good? Which leads to the, you know, clear question, so how do you tell? So in the case of Mill, he gives us a handy guide, the greatest happiness principle. So as you go through life and you want to say, will this be evil or good? You would basically do that calculation. If I do this, there'll be this happiness, this unhappiness, and if the happiness outweighs the bad, it's good. The reverse is true, evil. So what does Kant give us? Well, he claims the moral worth of an action lies not in its consequences. Why not? Well, his argument kind of goes like this. His claim is that morality requires a rational being to make that will. Again, it goes back to this thing about the goodwill. And he thinks that good consequences, or we'll say, a better way to put it is like happy, positive consequences, could result just by chance. For example, suppose after class, you know, you're walking back to your car, and you like hit a rock with your foot, and it flips over, and you see that it's a diamond as big as a baseball, and it's now yours. In that case, you're probably like fairly happy because now you're set for life. But of course, even though like you'd be really happy, Kant would say, well, it doesn't involve the will of a rational being, and even though it generated a lot of happiness, we wouldn't see that as a good, you know, morally good thing. And so his view is that goodness is not a matter of consequences, it's a matter of following the will. And he claims, which could be, you know, totally incorrect, that it's just a matter of, you know, as soon as you make the willing, the action is good or bad. So it's not the consequences that matter. Now, one way to kind of illustrate this is, to use a video game example. If you play these video games, it makes sense. If not, you're like, what is he talking about? But some video games, especially the ones done by a company called BioWare, they have, they did the famous Knights of the Old Republic, Neverwinter Nights, etc. And in these games, you get like to choose your actions. Like in the Star Wars game, you can go light side or dark side. And they give you like a little wheel to choose from. You know, like kill all the people or let them live. And if you pick, you know, evil, you automatically become like, it's an evil choice. If you pick, you know, good or light side, it's automatically good or light side. So it's not the consequences, it's like that choice. And so Kant kind of sees it that way. The idea is basically, it's a choice itself that decides whether it's good or evil, not the consequences. And again, the example I think it was like those video games. You just make you pick your choice, and it either is a good choice or a bad choice, based on the game designers, of course. So, how then do we know what is a good choice and what is a bad choice? How do we get the rule? Well, here's Kant's test. Here's how it works. What we do is the following. And he'll use an example to illustrate how we determine the good. So, in his illustration, we're asked to imagine a fairly common scenario. There's a person who needs money. Got to pay the rent, buy groceries, pay bills, etc. And it so often happens, these days, they don't have enough money. And so they want to borrow money, but they know they'll never be able to pay it back because, economy is horrible. So what the person is considering is this. Their question is it okay morally for me to borrow money that I know I cannot pay back? Would that be morally okay? And here's how Kant says you do the test. Now first he thinks there are two distinct questions. One is a moral question. Is this the right thing to do or not? The second question is what can be considered a question of practicality in the normal sense or prudence. Basically the question would be, would this be a smart idea? From a practical standpoint, would I get more pluses than minuses? And so Kant pretty much relegates the utilitarian calculation out of morality into just a practical consideration. To illustrate, like when it comes to the money thing, there'd be first the moral concern. Would it be wrong of me to lie to get money? But there's also, of course, the practical concerns. What is my chance of being able to get away with this? If I don't get away with it, what's likely to happen? Like how much time in jail, for example. And those would all be practical concerns. How likely am I to get away with it? What are the penalties if I don't succeed? What are the rewards if I do succeed? And Kant says it's one thing to be moral, to act in a way because it's right, or not do it because it's wrong. It's quite another to not do something because one is afraid of excuse me, more pixel dust. To not do something because one is afraid of the consequences. So for example, if I say I'm not going to lie because it's wrong, that'd be moral. If I say, well, I'm not going to lie because I'll probably get caught, and although banks can freely steal from us, most of the time when we steal from them, we get in a lot of trouble, so won't do that because I don't feel like doing a lot of hard time. And of course that wouldn't be moral. If I don't lie to the bankers because I don't want to do jail time, I'm not being good, I'm just being practical. So the consequences for Kant, not part of the morality. So the question remains moral or immoral. Here's how he works out the test. So what we do according to Kant, if we want to know should I do this or not, first thing we do is this. Create a maxim. Not the magazine for men, but something different. In this case, a maxim is a self-given, self-interested permission to take action. In other words, I give myself permission to do something that I want to do because I think it's advantageous to me. In this case, my maxim would be, when I need money and I can't pay it back, I will lie. The next step is determining whether this is morally okay or not. And here's how Kant says the test works. What I have to do, according to Kant, is consider whether or not I can take my maxim, my self-given, self-interested permission to act, namely that when I can't pay back money, I'll lie to get it, whether that could be rationally a universal law. In this case, universal law is exactly what it sounds like. It is permission to everyone, universal, that they don't have to, but they can do that action. So my maxim would be, when I need money and I can't pay it back, I can lie. The corresponding universal law would be, when anyone needs money and they can't pay it back, they can lie. In other words, I'm asked to imagine a world where the moral rules have changed, where the moral rule is lying is okay. If I can do both, will both, then the action is okay. If I can't will both, then according to Kant, it would be irrational and immoral, so it would be wrong to do. So we can take the example of the lying. Now, suppose there was a universal law that everyone could lie. So imagine, if you will, a world just like ours with that one change. Instead of lying is wrong, and you shouldn't lie, it is now a world in which lying is okay, in which everyone can lie. Now in that case, how effective would lying be? Well, to use an analogy, think like in sports, using steroids, or any of those enhancing drugs. Currently, of course, they're considered wrong and outlawed and illegal. And of course, people do want to use them because it gives them an advantage. But of course, if everyone was allowed to use steroids, they would no longer provide any advantage. Likewise, if everyone lied, lying wouldn't work anymore. People would go in and they'd promise stuff and be like, well, I don't believe it because everyone lies. So for Kant, it would be self-defeating, because I want to lie to get an advantage, namely get money and not pay it back. But if everyone could lie, lying would be worthless. I couldn't get the money because I wouldn't be believed, because it would be known that everyone can lie. So I can't will both. So I can't will a world where everyone can lie. So according to Kant at least, my lying would be wrong. So crudely put, his test is this. So you want to do something. Can you rationally, not being insane or overcome with emotions, etc., can you rationally, calmly will that be such that everyone could do it? You're not requiring that everyone does do it. You're just saying everyone could do it. So, for example, sometimes people say, well, we can't allow same-sex marriage because what if everyone became gay? There wouldn't be more people. It's like, well, that's true, but it's the same thing would be, what if everyone became Catholic priests? Then we wouldn't have more people. But it's not that everyone has to do it, it's that people can do it. There's a big difference between, being able to do it and being required to do it. Because most things, if everyone did do it, it would probably be bad. Like being a doctor. If everyone was a doctor, there'd be no one to do anything else, like, grow food and stuff. So that's his test. Crudely put, is it good for me to do this, or is it okay? Well, am I willing to allow everyone to do the same thing, rationally and reasonably? The answer is yes. Cool. If not, not cool. Now, so for Kant, that is the thing. That's how you tell. And so we're supposed to do this based on not practicality, not the advantages, but based on this, what he considers a principle of duty. So that's his test. Before pressing on to the next exciting slide, anything about this? It needs more stuff. Now he calls this, as I mentioned before, the categorical imperative. And he believes that, getting to the law and will part, that this ties into rational beings, which for him are really important. We'll see why in just a bit. That only rational beings can act in accord with the law, to follow the law. Because, well, to use an illustration, if a tree falls over, it's got to follow the laws of gravity. And we do too. Like if we fall off a building, we follow those laws. But when it comes to morality, people can choose to break or follow those laws. And he believes that it is a matter of the will, to choose to follow the moral rule or choose to break it. Now, a good question might be, why does he call this the categorical imperative? Well, he considers two types of imperatives. One type is the hypothetical imperative. And a hypothetical is, kind of conditional. If this, then that. And a hypothetical imperative is an imperative in which it's basically of the form, if you want this, do this. Like in making money. If you want to make a profit, buy low, sell high. If you want to lose weight, eat less, exercise more. That type of stuff. And those are all hypothetical, because they're on the condition that you want to achieve something. Make money, lose weight, whatever. Now the categorical imperative is categorical. You might have heard, like, when politicians do something, sketchy or awful, they'll always categorically deny they've done that. Basically, it's like a total denial. And so a categorical imperative is not a, if you want this, do this. It's simply a, do this. It's not hypothetical. So you're always supposed to do that. So what is his categorical imperative? Well, it's this. And again, like every great moral theory, you can give it in one sentence. And it's, act on the maxim whereby thou canst, at the same time, will, without contradiction, the corresponding universal law. Or again, kind of crudely put, if you want to do something, and you want to know what's okay or not, ask yourself, can I will, without contradiction, that my personal rule become a rule for everyone? Or crudely put, it's okay for me to do it, if everyone can do it too. It's kind of a golden rule. Do unto others, do them do unto you, or in this case, do as you would have everyone be able to do. So if someone says, yeah, I want to do this, but no one else should be allowed to do that, then wrong. Or if it's, yeah, I want to do this, yeah, it's fine if everyone can do this too, then in Kant's view, crudely put, be okay. Assuming again the person is like, sane, etc., etc. Now to illustrate this, Kant presents 4 examples. And what he tries to do with these basically is a couple of things. One is to illustrate his theory, to kind of show to people like, here's how it works, kind of like examples. Also, of course, these can be used as a way to sort of argue for a theory. One way to argue for a moral theory is to, use it and get results. And then sort of the way the argument goes is to say, well, my theory says this is good. And if intuitively you think like that's good or bad or whatever, you would agree with the theory. So kind of a couple functions. One is to show the theory works, and one is to kind of like argue for. Because if you can show the theory has a certain result, and that result seems intuitively plausible, plus for the theory. Plus, if you're getting paid by the word, helps you max out that word count. Now the first thing he considers is suicide. In each of these cases, he sets it up in kind of a complicated way. He begins laying out, a scenario. This is the situation. And then what he does is has like a person, pausing in the situation and engaging in sort of applying Kant's moral theory and then leading to the conclusion. So the scenario is this. In the suicide case, you have someone who has grown weary of life. And they believe that their continued existence will create more unhappiness than happiness. And they're considering ending their existence. But they're not so sad that they can't use the Kantian test. Now, given what Kant says, you think he would say, well, the maxim is a person can kill himself. Can that person will that everyone can kill themselves when they're miserable? But instead of doing that, this is what Kant says. He says, the person is choosing to kill themselves out of self-love. So the universal law would be, out of self-love, a person can kill themselves. And Kant says that's a contradiction because self-love is supposed to lead to you staying alive, not killing yourself. So you can't do that, according to Kant. And again, it seems, some people criticize it by saying it seems like, cheap, because his theory should be, I want to kill myself when my life is really awful, and I will that anybody can do this when their life is really awful, no problem. But then he sticks in that self-love thing, I want to kill myself out of self-love, but self-love is supposed to preserve me, so I can't will that because it contradicts. So again, his critics say he's cheating, and his supporters say, no, he's not. Now, interestingly, as we'll see, even though Kant doesn't base his morality on religion, these all correspond to things that are in Christianity. Suicide is out, lying is out, the parable of talents right here, and the parable of the Good Samaritan. So even though he doesn't base it on God, he wants to keep, sort of those core ethics in place, which may be, a problem for him, because again, critics say that his theory can't, always work the way he wants it to work. We already saw the law and promises. We saw how that works out, and that, of course, is, drawn from the idea that, thou shalt not, bear false witness and lie. The third one is kind of unusual. You may be familiar with the parable of the talents. There's a scenario in which someone is going off to town, and he leaves his, basically his staff or his servants with some money. And the term for money is talents, which is also useful because it also means, of course, talents. And he gives one person, gets one talent, and the person goes and hides it, conceals it. And the person, the other, servants like invested the money or something, and the person comes back, and the criticism, of course, is that if a person has a a talent, they shouldn't conceal it from the world, even if they have but a single one. Now, what Kant is talking about here, basically, he says in the following scenario. Imagine you get someone who's doing pretty well. Let's take like a concrete example. Suppose you get someone who's thinking about going to like medical school. They're pre-med right now. And then, they, during their grocery shopping, they buy a lottery ticket, and they check the numbers, and they see they've won $35 million. They're like, they go and get their money, they're like, done. Dropping out of school, it's going to live on $35 million. So the person has got talent. They could have been a doctor, but they're well off now. They got that $35 million. They don't need to go off to be a doctor. They don't need to do anything anymore except spend that $35 million. Now, Kant's view is that that would be wrong. Now again, given the way he sets up his test, it should be, my maxim is, if I win $35 million and I don't feel like going to medical school, I'm not going. And it seems like you could extend it to other people. If anybody wins $35 million, they don't feel like going to medical school, they don't gotta go. Seems fine. But Kant says, nope, that'd be wrong. Again, probably because of the parable of the talents. But his reasoning is this. He doesn't use his method. He says, as rational beings, we're obligated to use our talents, essentially. We just got to do it. And again, critics have said, that's just, you're just making stuff up. And people, of course, who defend him say, no, he's got it right. So it seems a bit of a problem. Fourth illustration is presumably based on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And that, of course, there's a person who is traveling the road, falls among thieves, and is wounded and robbed and left to die. And a person from Samaria, a good Samaritan, comes along, finds him, takes him out of the ditch, binds up his wounds, takes him to town, and helps him. And the lesson, of course, is that we're supposed to help other people. Now, the way Kant sets it up is this. Imagine someone who's very well off. Suppose you have someone who's, a person who's won like a $35 million. And so they're driving through town in their limo. And they drive past, people who are living on the street, eating out of dumpsters, just trying to survive. Got nothing. And the person says, I won't harm anyone. I'm not going to have, my chauffeur go out and beat that poor homeless person, or kill him, or make those hobos fight for money. But of course, I'm not going to help anyone. Yeah, I've got $35 million. I could, still live incredibly well and help out a lot of people. But I'm not going to do it. Not going to hurt him. Not going to help him. Now again, given Kant's view, it would have been, the maximum universal law thing. If I don't want to help people, can I will that no one help anyone? Now, what Kant says is this. He says you can't. Why not? Well, in a way, he almost gets consequentialist here. He says you can't will that because on some day, you may find yourself in need of help. So, for example, the person who won the $35 million may make a bad investment. They might decide to invest in some company that goes bankrupt. Now they got nothing. Or they may, their limo may flip over and they're, pinned, in a river, die, already to drown. And they may probably want someone to go down there and pull them out of the wreckage. They probably want to be, dying. And so his reasoning basically is you can't will both, because you'd want someone to help you. Now, one way people have replied to that, because it is kind of a standard argument, it's basically the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated yourself. And so we'd want to help other people because if we were starving, we'd want someone who had food to share with us. If we were pinned under a wreck in the river with the water coming up over our head, we want someone to come down there and pull us out of the wreck. if we were dying and unable to pay for, surgery, that we'd want people to help us. And so, and we'd have to give what we would want, treat others as we want to be treated ourselves. Now, one way to reply to this, of course, is kind of what's sometimes called the problem of the fanatic. Someone who can say, I will not help others, and I would refuse their help. And there are people like that, who would claim they'd rather starve than accept a handout from someone. They would rather, die, than accept, socialized medicine. And there probably are people like that. And a good question to be is that a legitimate position? But Kant presents those 4 examples. So, recap, suicide, for Kant, wrong, and since he's an absolutist, always wrong. Lying, wrong, always wrong. Letting your talents rust, wrong, always wrong. Helping others, well, as long as, it's not like helping them do awful stuff, that would be right. Now also again, Kant's a moral absolutist, so doesn't allow exceptions. So lying would always be wrong, suicide would always be wrong. So imagine the following quandary. Suppose there's someone who is despondent and they're about to commit suicide. But you know that if you lied to them, they won't kill themselves. And then they'll, calm down and you'll be able to save them. Now Kant would say that their kill themselves would be wrong. Your lying to them, even to presumably save them, would presumably also be potentially wrong. And that's kind of one of the problems with absolutism. No exceptions. Now, not all deontologists are absolutists. Some do allow exceptions, but Kant he's hardcore. He's an absolutist. Okay, before pressing on to a remainder of the Kant stuff, any stuff about Rustin or lying or helping others that needs more stuff? Now, another thing that moral theories also generally tend to do is tell us who and what is valuable, that has moral status, and which things have less or no moral status. We saw in John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism a pretty generous theory, because he says that all of sentient creation, all things that feel pleasure and pain, matter. Because for the utilitarian, the pain of anything is bad, and the happiness, pleasure of anything is good. Which is why many people who want to have a moral theory to justify things like animal rights or good treatment of animals, they're often utilitarians, because that provides a nice foundation. Now Kant also divides the world up into things that count and things that don't. And his split is pretty sharp. There are the things that count, and there are things that don't count at all. Now the things that count, or rather the beings that count, are what he calls rational beings. That's us. Now, the other category of things are what he calls the objects of the inclination. And I guess it's doing what it wants. Okay, getting back to the object of inclination, I'll wait for this to maybe do something. Here's how he draws the distinction. Rational beings for him have worth. And luckily that's us. That's a good thing. The other stuff, what he calls the objects of the inclination, they Windows. They don't have worth. So the way he sees it, the distinction is, oh, no wonder it's updating. Okay, I'll just have to operate from memory for the rest of this stuff. So, okay, so you have the object's inclination, here's the difference. So rational beings have worth, objects of inclination don't have worth. They derive their worth from the worth we give them. Going back to the ancient days of like a couple times ago, it's the distinction between things that have intrinsic value and things that have extrinsic value. And so for Kant, the object of inclination would include such things as, well, anything that's not people. It would include obvious things like backpacks and roast beef sandwiches, kiwis, both the fruit and the bird, and would also include, for Kant, would include animals as well, because he regards them as being objects of the inclination. Now, interestingly, boringly enough for our good dead friend Immanuel Kant, he does have a sort of a separate approach to animals. Because given his view, if animals are just objects of inclination, their only value would be that we value them. So, taking this sort of at face value, it would be like if you have a pet, then it'd be wrong for people to harm the pet because it's your pet. You provide like moral cover, so to speak. But if something was just like an animal, just kind of not owned by people or valued by people, then it could not be wrong. Now Kant, though, interestingly, in many ways is kind of better than his theory. In an essay on animals and how to treat them, he kind of, well, it may be seen as kind of like cheating, or kind of in a nice way. What he claims is this, is that although we owe nothing to animals, because they have no moral status, they're things and not people, he argues that we have indirect obligations to them. Roughly put, that if we are bad to animals, to whom we have no obligations, we'll probably become bad to people, to whom we have obligations. To use a crappy analogy, we can kind of think of the way we treat animals is kind of like practice or a simulator. So using that crappy analogy, imagine you have someone who's training as a police officer. Now, of course, in the simulator, none of that's real. I mean, it's simulation. It's just computer-generated stuff and just images. So you can't actually. I mean, a person can stand there and shoot the simulated gun to the simulated targets, and no one gets hurt because it's all simulated. But of course, if a person is kind of slack in their practice and they just like every time something pops up, they shoot everybody. Well, what might happen, of course, is that when they are dealing with real situations, that bad training or sloppy practice may become their habit. And so Kant gives that argument for mean and bad to animals, that can make us so we're bad to people. And so he kind of avoids being bad to animals that way. So getting back to rational beings, we're pretty lucky in that regard. Being rational, we have moral worth. In some cases, like absolute moral worth. Now, a good question is, of course, so why? Well, here's his reasoning. Essentially, it's a matter of consistency. In my own case, I regard myself as a rational being, a person, and I regard myself as having moral worth. And so my reasoning is I have moral worth because I'm a person. And of course, going back to the whole golden rule thing, I want to be treated well. So the argument basically is if I regard myself as a person entitled to be treated well, I have to extend that same thing to all other people to be consistent. So if I'm a person and so I have moral status, I have to accept that every other person has moral status too, because they're people. And you can also, again, kind of golden rule it. If I want to be treated, as a person, if I want to be treated as a person, I have to treat others as I want to be treated myself. Now, Kant takes this to lead to what some call the second formulation of the categorical imperative. Because the first one is the act the maximum by the blah blah blah, and the second one goes like this. He says we have to treat rational nature, rational beings, as an end, not just a means only. So what does that mean? Well, this is what it means. So as rational beings, we're ends. Objects of inclination are just means. Now, how then must we treat people? Well, what his claim is since we are ends, we can't be treated just as means. So his second formulation is, we must treat rational nature and ourselves or as others as an end, not as a means only. Roughly put, we can't treat people as things. We have to treat them as people. Now, does this mean that we can never use people as a means to an end? Well, the answer is, no. So, for example, suppose you're going to like Publix, and you get your groceries, you wheel them up to the thing, and you put them at the checkout line. Are you allowed to have someone, bag your groceries and check you out? Because that would be, using them as a means, because they're a means to get your groceries into the bag so you can have, lunch and dinner. Now, Kant would say, given his view, as long as you don't treat them just as a means only, but still respect them as an end, then it'd be okay. So, next time you're having if you're getting your groceries bagged, you'd want to say, although you're bagging my groceries, rest assured that I still respect you as a rational being of absolute moral worth. And then give them a big hug, because people like to be hugged. Don't hug people. Okay, so that's the second formulation, the rational thing. Now, of course, that does have a certain appeal to it, because from our own perspective, we don't want to be treated as things. We don't want people just killing us, to take our stuff, or like in the urban myths, we don't want people just, drugging us and stealing our kidneys. So, for the most part, we do want to be treated as people rather than things. And to be consistent, presumably, we would have to extend the same to others. And that's his supreme practical principle. Not to be confused with the nacho supreme. Now, his third formulation of the categorical imperative, as some people see it, is this. Well, one question, of course, comes up is, he's been talking about these laws. And the question would be like, who are the lawmakers? Because if you get laws, someone's going to make them. And he comes up with this concept called the kingdom of ends. Kind of like the Magic Kingdom, only without any rides or any fun. But here's the idea. Kant believes that all rational beings, all of us, we form the kingdom of ends. We are all citizens of this kingdom because we are ends. That is to say, we have worth. We're not things. We're not means. We're beings of value. Now, in terms of the lawmaking, here's how he thinks it works. We are the lawmakers. We are the citizens and lawmakers of the kingdom of ends. And the reason why he thinks that we have to be the lawmakers is this. If morality is imposed from the outside by, something supernatural or imposed by an authority from the outside, that would not be morality. We'd just be compelled to do that. So if we're forced to do stuff, then it's not being moral. Or if we're doing it out of, fear or hope for reward, it's not being moral. So if I don't lie because I don't want to, go to jail, I'm not being good, I'm just being practical. If I do like nice things because I'm planning on running for office and I want to boost my status, I'm not being good, I'm just being practical. If someone acts, nice to avoid hell and hope to get heaven, they're not being good, they're just being practical. They want to get a payoff and they want to avoid toasting the fires of hell forever. Also for Kant, if someone acts on the basis of their desires, how they feel, they're not acting morally. For Kant, you've got to act morally, it can't be imposed from the outside, it can't be based on desires and fears and, basically consequences. It has to be a matter of free choice. So we have to make the rules have to come from us, And we have to be free to follow them or break them. And we have to choose the rule to follow it, in a sense, for its own sake, not for a gain or advantage or out of fear. So his view is basically morality's got to be a free choice, and you've got to make the rules. And the way to make the rules, according to Kant, is, of course, using his categorical imperative. Or so he claims. Now, the last thing for Kant, then we'll go to some problems with Kant's view, are his famous 3 postulates of morality. And famously, Kant claims there are 3 things that we, maybe not everybody, but at least sort of general we really, 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 really want. But he claims they're unprovable. But we gotta have them in order to have morality, and we really, really want morality, so we gotta accept them. Kant was also known for this method where he was called the transcendent method. And the idea was basically, his claim was there are things that we can't know. They're beyond our experience. Basically what he calls the transcendent illusions of metaphysics. But they're irresistible to us. Even though we can't know them, we really, really, really want to talk about them. And what he argues is even if we can't prove that something exists, if we can show a moral need, or maybe some other need for it, we can infer that if we really, really want one thing, in this case morality, and it requires this other stuff, then we get to accept these things, which is either pretty clever or a total cheat, or possibly both. But here's how it makes it happen. First, freedom. Now, when Kant was doing his stuff, he believed that Newton's physics was the final complete physics. Obviously, he was doing his stuff before Einstein. Einstein came along and revised physics. Newton's stuff, hasn't been really proven wrong. It's not it's useless now, but a slight change. But what Kant believed, which still seems true now, is that if you look at science, there's no proof we're free. Metaphysically having free will. In fact, if we look at the sciencey stuff, all the science seems to point to the opposite, that we are not free. I mean, to use some obvious examples, think about conditions like depression. That's not a free choice. It's the chemicals in the brain that cause people to be depressed. We know or believe that when people are, say, very aggressive or violent, that it's due to neurochemicals, biology, etc. And so when people explain all the things that we do, and scientifically, it's all explained not in terms of free choice, it's explained in terms of biochemistry, neurophysiology, etc. So all the science seems to point to us not being free. Because if you take the brain apart, you don't find a little free will thing in there. You just find neurons and all that goop. And so science tells us we're not free. But one obvious implication of this is, if we're not free, then morality goes out the window. Why? Well, in order for something to be something we ought to do morally, it has to be something we can do. In other words, we have to be able to choose to do that. Or looked at another way, let's take the following scenario. Suppose someone's walking along outside there, and the tree suddenly falls over and crushes them. Now, do we charge the tree with murder? No, because trees don't choose. They don't have free choice. Now, if someone's there with a chainsaw, or you're cutting the tree and they drop it on someone intentionally, we charge them with murder because we think the person had a choice. And if someone doesn't have any choice, to use another example, if you're driving along in your car and someone hops out in front of you and you hit them, true, you killed them, but you wouldn't be charged because you couldn't, it wasn't your choice, you couldn't stop it. But if someone sees somebody and goes up on the sidewalk after them and runs them over, we regard them as responsible because we think they could have done otherwise. So it seems critical to morality that we're free. That what is required for someone to be good or evil is that we make a choice between doing one thing or the other. But Kant says we can't prove it. In fact, science shows we're not free, but in order to have morality, we've got to be free, or so we claim. Which is kind of a big problem today, because again, the more progress we make in the sciencey stuff, the more and more shows that there seems to be no freedom. And if there is no freedom, no choice, then it makes no sense to talk about good or evil. We don't, like if your computer crashes, you don't go curse it and say evil computer. I mean, you may say that, but it doesn't make any sense. It just does what it does because it is what it is. It can't do otherwise. And same with people. If we aren't free, we just think we're free, it makes no sense to say that people are good or bad. People are just doing what they're doing. They're defective or properly functioning, just like a computer. And some people actually advocate that. They think that when people are doing stuff they call evil, they're just like defective machines. And what you do is, with a defective machine, you don't, like if your laptop crashes, you don't take your laptop and give it a timeout, or punish it, or put it go and put it in the cupboard and lock it up there for a while and say, you'll stay in there, your sentence is 20 days in solitary confinement laptop. Think about that the next time you want to crash. That'd be stupid. And so with people, what you do if you take that view is instead of locking people up or punishing them, you just fix them. A little surgery, a little chemistry, poof, you get a better people through modification. But anyways, so for Kant, to recap, we don't seem to be free. Science says we're not. But we need freedom to have morality. We really, really want morality, so we get to believe. Second, immortality. Kant believes it's something we can't prove. Which is right, because if we did find that people survived after death, we wouldn't know that they were immortal, because immortal means existing forever. So in a way, you never really know because you'd have to go forever. So he thinks, okay, we can't prove it. But here's why he thinks we gotta have it. Now, one condition on a moral theory that most people agree with is that a moral theory has to be practical. In other words, the average person has to be able to live up at least to the basics, at least to being not evil. But if a moral theory expects too much of people, that's a mark against it. Now, Kant requires that people achieve moral perfection, which of course would seem to be really unreasonable, because that's really impossible. Unless, of course, you have forever to get it right. And so what Kant does, in kind of a weird thing, he says, well, moral theories have to be such that people can live up to them. His moral theory requires moral perfection. So, solution, immortality. You've got forever to get it right. If you have forever, eventually you will. Which seems like a weird way to go about doing it, but kind of clever. Lastly, for the three postulates, God. As we saw in the ancient days of part 2, Kant contended that there's no way to prove or disprove God's existence. But he said, that it leaves the door open for proving or accepting God based on faith or a moral reason. So why do we need God in this role? Well, first off, Kant dismisses the idea that God would serve as the motivator for morality. I mean, a common view that people use is, well, you should be good because if you are, heaven is reward, and if you're bad, hell for punishment. But Kant's view is, if a person just does good because they're afraid of punishment and hope for reward, they're not really good. They're just practical. They're just doing what it takes to avoid harm and get benefits, which is not, morally good. It's just being, smart. So then, if God is not the motivator for ethics, what does he do? Well, Kant claims that morality, justice requires that good be rewarded and that evil be punished. But of course, if you've been around for a while, you probably noticed that evil does pretty well, and good often does very badly. Like the good die young type of deal. Now, because of that, because there is very little or perhaps no justice here, And we want justice, because without justice, morality would be effectively nothing. You know, if being good results in is never rewarded and being evil is never punished, that throws out the whole concept of justice. And so we crave, we need, we demand justice. And we're not going to get it here. So we need God. God is there to satisfy that condition that wickedness is punished and goodness is rewarded. So, in recap, he claims there are three things that are improvable: freedom, immortality, and God. But he claims you gotta have them if you're gonna have morality. We really, 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 really want morality, so we have to accept freedom, immortality, and God. After Kant, later philosophers came along and argued against this stuff, and people still argue about it to this day. Before going to our final thing for the Kantian stuff, namely everything that's wrong with Kant in 10 minutes or less, anything about the stuff so far that needs more stuff? Okay. Now, just like with any moral theory, if Kant's moral theory was like perfect and stuff, you just learn his theory. You know, you'd be like when you learn math and physics and stuff, you just taught one view and that's that. But in the case of ethics, we get all kinds of competing theories, and everyone, of course, thinks they're right, but everyone has a lot of problems. And here are some of the problems. Problem one. Critics point out that when Kant talks about, this duty, a fair question is duty to who or what? Because normally I think of like duty, we have some sort of, clear context. For example, if someone goes into the US military, swears an oath to the Constitution, they have a duty to the Constitution, they have a duty to their fellow soldiers, the country, etc. Similarly, if you, have a job.
Sorry to interrupt. Did anybody see a wallet in here?
A wallet? Was it up here or like in the
Right there.
on the desk? Do you check at the dean's office from COA? Because sometimes people, that's kind of a lost and found thing, but that's there. So when you think of like a job, you get a list of contract and obligations. That kind of duty makes sense. But sort of this general notion of duty seems sort of too vague and amorphous to apply. Now, of course, people who are Kantians, they have ways of applying to that. They can talk about, bring the thing about the categorical imperative and the whole idea of this kingdom of ends, or they can speak about a duty to, goodness and reason and so forth. So for every objection, of course, there's a counter. Second problem rests on the absolutism. As we saw, we were going through the dreaded spectrum of morality. The appeal of absolutism is it's absolute. There's no gray, there's no fuzz, there's good, there's evil, and there's no fuzzy stuff. And for every problem, there's a definitive solution, which is kind of appealing. Now, on the downside, as we saw, the sort of objection or argument against or problem with absolutism is that it has no flexibility. So if lying is wrong, it's always wrong. But as we saw in the ancient days a couple of days ago, that intuitively think there are cases when lying could be okay. Cases like saving people's lives, cases like making people feel better, cases like lying to children about Santa Claus and Easter Bunny, etc. And so for those who find absolutism problematic, that would be a problem for Kant's absolutism. Now the counter to that is, of course, to argue in favor of absolutism, because there are also counter-intuitions that accepting what is bad as good would be a mistake. And so for those who find absolutism appealing, this would not be a problem. Thirdly, there is the problem with rationality. It's not that rationality is bad, but the way, again, Kant sets up the world is if you're a rational being, you get that absolute worth, and if something's an object of inclination, it has no value. And some may raise the question, why accept rationality as what is the defining sort of standard for morality? Why should it be being rational gives something worth, and then other stuff doesn't. To use a concrete illustration, when we were looking at John Stuart Mill before, for him what mattered was, you know, pleasure and pain. So beings that could feel pleasure and pain would count, even if they weren't rational. And so people, for example, who favor rights for animals, also people who are concerned about people who are not rational, you know, issues like euthanasia, abortion, etc., they would want to have something more perhaps than rationality. And so this comes down to basically a battle or dispute over what it is that makes things have moral worth, what quality or qualities. And for Kant, it's rationality. And critics say, why consider that the definitive quality? Why not something like ability to feel pleasure or pain, or the ability to write poetry, or any other type of thing. Fourth problem. Some critics have brought up the objection that given Kant's, you know, system, you know, maximum universal law thing, that it would seem that things that were, you know, terrible, intuitively wrong, could pass his test. For example, suppose someone really, really hates, well, we can take the example of ISIS, the terrorist group. They really, really hate people who disagree with them, and so if you had a member of ISIS and said, you know, what would be your maxim? And their maxim might be, we may kill all non-believers, all the infidels. And of course, if you ask them, would you allow everyone to do this? And they would of course say yes, they would want everyone to be able to kill all the infidels, as defined by them. So it seemed that people could will something terrible and, you know, have it to be seemingly consistent. Now, those who reply to this would say, well, the easy way to sort of prevent this is to go with the second formulation, because we take the example of like killing the infidels, and that'd be treating people as a means to an end, of, you know, the ends of this case of ISIS. And so perhaps Kant is a way around that. And our final closing problem is the kingdom of ends. Now, on the one hand, the idea that we're beings of more worth and are part of the kingdom of ends is pretty good. So it means that, for example, a lot of the stuff that people want to do to other people, like genocide, exploiting them, enslaving them, you know, harming them, otherwise doing all the horrible things people seem to really love to do to other people, would all be out. They would, for Kant, all that stuff's wrong, which seems like a, you know, pretty good thing. Now the critics, of course, typically don't say, well, you know, we want to treat people as things, although some people obviously do. Their criticism is, even though this is like good, it doesn't tell us how to handle, you know, concrete moral disputes. That, you know, for example, disputes over, say, who gets a parking space. Because you know, if we both say we're both beings of absolute worth, but who gets a parking space? Now people who support Kant say, well, we can work this out, you know, which is what people always say. Okay, so those are some of the problems, some of the potential replies, and that brings us to the end of Immanuel Kant, who said a lot of stuff, wrote a lot of stuff, died, still dead today. Next time we'll head into the realm of art and aesthetics. So in terms of the Grady stuff, if you want to get a +5 bonus,